Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 1 for History 102. And we're going to start out with some background information that will lead us right into the information contained in the first chapter in this book, which is chapter 15, because this is the volume 2. So volume 1 would be chapters 1 through 14, which is about Reconstruction in America after the Civil War. But first, we want to talk a little bit about the effects of the Civil War, how it ended, and the very important month of April 1865, when we're really starting our studies. April 1865 was an extremely important month in American history. In fact, some historians argue it was the most important month ever in American history. And there's even entire books written about April of 1865. So, we want to talk about two very important events that occurred in April of 1865. And the very first event that occurred was on April 9th, 1865. That is the day when General Robert E. Lee, the commander of Confederate forces, surrendered to the commander of Union forces, General Ulysses S. Grant. This event took place at what's known as the Appomattox Courthouse in the state of Virginia. Sometimes it's also known as the Mcclain House because the Mcclain family owned the Appomattox Courthouse. Now, this is where the two generals met in an arranged meeting where General Lee had been defeated for weeks by Ulysses S. Grant and his army and had finally come to the conclusion there was no use in going any forward, that the war was lost, and he needed to hand his sword to General Ulysses S. Grant. Now, this was an event that had been prepared for. Both armies sent their representatives. Grant had a New Yorker with him who transcribed the whole event for prosperity's sake, and that's one of his officers who was a Seneca Indian, Eli Parker, a very famous Iroquois Civil War hero and aide to General Grant, who was there writing down everything that transpired as Lee surrendered to Grant. Now, when Lee surrenders to Grant, this ends the most horrible war in terms of human loss in American history. You'll find a link in the Reconstruction mini lectures on the Moodle website. You're going to find plenty of links, and I encourage you to go to all those links if you want to find out more detailed information. There'll be a link there to the Appomattox Courthouse National Park. There'll also be a link to a short lecture delivered by Dr. David Hacker of SUNY Binghamton, where he reanalyzes the total number of deaths during the Civil War. Back when I went to college, the standard number that I was taught as far as Americans losing their lives during this horrible conflict was approximately 620,000 men. Now, that number has been reevaluated by historians like James McPherson and Dr. David Hacker, and a more accurate number is believed to be 750,000 deaths during this 4-year struggle in the Civil War. Now, to put this in perspective, the total population of the United States was only 31 million people at the time, and 750,000 people lost their lives. So that would be, if in modern terms, a war of that devastating effect, every single one of you would know someone who died in that war. Everybody who lived in the United States either had a relative, close friend, or maybe more than one who lost their lives in the war. And the one thing that you have to keep reminding yourselves of, the reason why the casualties were so high, everyone who died was an American. It was Americans fighting Americans. So there's no such thing in the Civil War as enemy casualties. Everyone who died was an American. So you can take all the other wars that we ever fought in the history of the United States, add the casualties together, and they will not reach 750,000. It's the most devastating war we were ever involved in. And also, another point to make sure you understand, it's the last major war fought entirely on American soil. Modern wars that we've been involved in, like the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and so forth, none of the fighting took place in the United States. And that's important because that means there's no civilian casualties in wars fought in other lands, and there's no infrastructure damage to the United States. As a result of the Civil War, the South was devastated, and large portions of it were completely destroyed, like the city of Atlanta and Charleston, to name a couple. So, a very, very devastating war as far as human costs are concerned, but also in economic costs. Now, to give you an idea of the economic impact of this war, in 1860, before the war began, now most of you know, the Civil War began in 1861, in April of 1861. The national debt for the United States was $65 million. After the war ends and the Union tallies up the total, now remember, this is only the Union debt that becomes the national debt. We'll talk about what happens to the Confederate debt later. The government now is faced with a debt that was just 5 years earlier, remember, $65 million. Now the national debt is $2.7 billion. That was an unheard of sum of money. To put it into perspective, that's twice as much money as the United States government had spent in federal budgets from 1781 to 1860. And it was just an unheard of sum. When that became public knowledge, a lot of Americans thought, we're doomed. We might have won this war, we might have restored the Union, but there's no way in hell we'll ever pay off $2.7 billion. It's an economic disaster. But as we'll find out in the course of our study, we'll have this debt paid off by the 1880s. America is going to really boom and prosper during the Gilded Age, and the gloom and doom that appeared to exist in April of 1865 and after quickly went away economically. Now, so, recapping a little bit, April 9th, 1865, Civil War ends, the Union wins, and what this means to the soldiers in both armies. For the Union Army, especially the ones under Ulysses S. Grant's command, it was a short march from central Virginia to Washington, D.C., where all the troops will form up that were in the Union Army. And then later on in May, before they're all discharged out of the Army, there'll be a massive 3-day parade in the streets of Washington, D.C., celebrating the great Union victory and honoring all the troops who fought so valiantly with a 3-day celebration and parade in the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, it's a very different story for the Confederate soldiers. They lost. They had to all lay down their arms, and then Lee, in a farewell address to his troops, thanks them for their bravery and their service, but then basically discharges them all from an army that doesn't exist anymore, the Confederate Army. And these men literally had to walk home to where they came from. Some of them are from Texas. They're going to have to walk from Virginia to Texas or to Florida or elsewhere, sort of with their tails between their legs too, because they just lost a 4-year-long bloody conflict. And when they return to their homes in the South, if you're from Atlanta, you're returning to burnt rubble. So, very different picture for the Confederate soldiers in the aftermath of the war, where the Union soldiers are going to be in D.C. celebrating, and then many of them will be returned to their homes via trains, because the Norse railroad system was basically untouched during the war. So, one other thing on the Appomattox Courthouse and or as it's known, the Mcclain House. I love little quirky facts about history, and here's one about the Mcclain family. The very first battle of the Civil War, known as the Battle of Bull Run, or sometimes it's also known as First Manassas, which happened in northern Virginia, basically not too far across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., happened on the Mcclain Farm. The Mcclain family lived near Manassas or Bull Run, and a lot of the battle took place right on their farm. After that horrible, bloody battle that they witnessed took place, they decided, we're getting out of here. This is going to be a hotbed probably for more battles. So they sold their farm and moved into the interior of Virginia and purchased what becomes known as the Appomattox Courthouse. So in a very odd twist of fate, the first land battle of the Civil War, Bull Run or First Manassas as it's known, happened on the Mcclain's land, and the surrender happened on the same family's land after they relocated. Strange twist of fate, but I love those sort of quirky little side stories in American history. So I had to share that with you. Now, back to April of 1865. Surrender happens on the 9th. The word quickly spreads to Washington, D.C. President Lincoln is ecstatic. It's finally over. People are celebrating. And then on April 14th, on Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, go to a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The play they went to see was My American Cousin. So Abraham Lincoln had also invited the Secretary of State Seward and Ulysses S. Grant to join him and Mary Todd Lincoln in the private presidential box at Ford's Theater to see this play. sort of as a little respite after 4 bloody long years of conflict. Abraham Lincoln and his wife were the only ones who go. Secretary of State Seward has an excuse why he's not going to attend, and so does Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. At this play is when a Confederate sympathizer and Confederate, I suppose you could call him, John Wilkes Booth, sneaks into Lincoln's box, pulls a gun out, shoots Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, and then leaps from the balcony where the box was located onto the stage of Ford's Theater, and then escapes out the backstage door where he had a horse waiting. He and his co-conspirators had planned this assassination plot. Some of his co-conspirators have been assigned to assassinate Ulysses S. Grant and Secretary of State Seward the same evening. In fact, one of his co-conspirators burst into Seward's home and wounded him, and luckily did not kill him. Abraham Lincoln will be taken across the street from Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., to the Peterson House, where he'll be laid in a bed and doctors will be called to attend to him. The doctors have the very sad news for Mary Todd Lincoln that her husband's a goner. It's just a matter of time. The bullet entered the back of his head and lodged behind his eye. And then that morning, Abraham Lincoln will pass away. Arguably our greatest president ever and our leader during this horrible conflict, the Civil War. It's a very horrible situation, especially when you think of the timing. April 9th, the Union is in a state of joyous celebration with the end of the Civil War. On April 14th, they're in a state of deep sorrow, losing their fearless leader, President Abraham Lincoln. Now, a couple things on this assassination. Back in this day and age, you might think, you might be saying to yourself, how in the world could somebody sneak in to the presidential box with a gun and shoot the president and escape, as John Wilkes Booth did? Back in this day and age, the president didn't have a security force assigned to him like today, the Secret Service. The Secret Service existed, but part of their duty was not protecting presidents. Their duty, originally, they were an offshoot of the Department of Treasury, and they were the team that went out and tried to catch counterfeiters, not protect presidents and other officials. So he really had no security. It was quite easy for John Wilkes Booth to do this. And he escapes, Booth does, crosses the Potomac into Virginia, but what happened to Booth initially when he leaped from the balcony onto the stage, he fractured his ankle. This fractured ankle was becoming more and more of a problem to him, so he had to stop and seek medical attention. John Wilkes Booth goes to a doctor down in Virginia, and you may or may not have heard of his name before, but you may have heard of the saying associated with him. He went and sought the treatment of Dr. Mudd, M-U-D-D. I don't know if you're familiar with the saying, but I can remember my grandmother telling me when I was a little boy that if I was acting up, I better knock it off, or she'd say, or your name will be Mudd. Dr. Mudd ends up going to prison as a co-conspirator to John Wilkes Booth, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with the assassination plot. uh, this is how desperate we were to solve this this case, and Mudd's going to be arrested after they find out he treated John Wilkes Booth for his fractured ankle. Doctors basically have no choice. If somebody's injured, comes to your office, you take a Hippocratic oath. You have to treat everybody. But unfortunately for him, it took his family forever to clear his good name. Now, John Wilkes Booth will finally be apprehended by a unit of the Union Army, a New York regiment, that the number of the regiment slips my memory, but I'll give you a link to it in the mini lecture. But I know about this unit because it was raised right here in the North Country. Much of the cavalry unit that tracks down John Wilkes Booth was raised right in Plattsburgh and also in Essex County. Another kind of ironic twist that, we have a local connection to the capture and killing of John Wilkes Booth. They'll find John Wilkes Booth. He'll resist arrest. He'll be shot in the process. And supposedly, according to the military, his dying words was he held his hands in front of his face, and as he died, he said, "Useless, useless." So Booth is dead, but one of his co-conspirators was arrested in the attempt to kill Seward, and it's uncovered that all these conspirators lived in a boarding house owned by a woman by the name of Mary Surratt. And Mary Surratt and the group of co-conspirators that survived will all be found guilty, and they'll be hanged for their crime, including Mary Surratt, who most historians believe today her only, I don't consider it a crime, her only ties to the conspiracy is she owned the boarding house where these clowns were living. So, all of this takes place in a matter of less than a week in April of 1865. So obviously you can see why April 1865 is arguably the most important month in U.S. history. Now, the other thing that quickly takes place after the death of President Lincoln is Vice President Andrew Johnson is sworn in as President of the United States. Now, Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee, but he was against the Confederacy leaving the Union. And when Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, he wanted to sort of put out an olive branch to the South. So he nominated, he selected as his vice presidential running mate a new person, Andrew Johnson, to kind of show that the Union and the South will be able to work together after this conflict is over. Now, no one in their wildest imagination ever believed that Andrew Johnson would be president of the United States. I'll be talking more about him in a future lecture, but this guy was not cut out to be president. He wasn't intelligent enough. He didn't have the skills, but that wasn't a concern back then, because the one thing you also have to remind yourselves of, Abraham Lincoln is the very first president ever assassinated in American history. We had presidents die in office from natural causes, but never did we have a president assassinated like this, where the vice president had to step up and be sworn in to take over. And Abraham Lincoln was not an elderly president, and he was in good health before, obviously, he was assassinated by Booth. So, very quickly, we're going to end up with a brand new leader who's not capable of leading this country. And he's going to end up making mistake after mistake after mistake. And ultimately, as we'll study later on, it's going to lead to him also being the first president ever brought up on impeachment charges. So, that's where I'm going to call her quits today. That's an introduction to get you ready to read chapter 15 on Reconstruction in your textbook. So, when I come back for another lecture, I'm going to start talking about what happens in the aftermath of putting this country back together after those 4 years of bloody struggle. So, everybody take care. I'll be talking to you soon in another lecture. So, be safe. Bye now.